Hello, my name is Keith Jones. I am the president and CEO of Soul Touch and Experiences. I am a disability advocate, activist for the last 30 years, basically since birth. And the company that I started is Soul Touch and Experiences, where we sit at the intersection of ethnicity, public policy, culture, and economics. The first time that I realized that there was access issues in America was birth. Being a person of color with a disability, you kind of really understand where the electrified fence is in American social economic structure. The irony is that disability is also the other thing that you realize that once in the early 70s, it didn't matter if you were white or black in St. Louis. If you had a disability, you only went to one school. So inclusion was not an issue that we would ever have to enjoy, but desegregation, we did that instantly, solely based on the fact that students with disabilities should, and what they called us were the handicapped kids or the crippled kids. Now that was in the early 70s. In the mid 70s and early 80s, going to school in upstate New York and in Boston with 766, you start to see, the question I would ask my mother, why is it so hard for me just to go to class, just to go to school? And so the access issues weren't necessarily around the fact that I didn't know math, I didn't know English. It was solely based on somebody's belief that my humanity or my human condition was an impediment to my intelligence. Then you get to the 80s and the late 90s, or the early 90s, going on graduating high school, being one of the two kids who were mainstream, quote unquote, and being included in regular classes still was, for me, odd because I didn't understand why I could do it and my people couldn't. My homeboys couldn't go to class with me. I didn't see any distinction between what I was doing, what they were doing, except for the fact that educated people had decided, well, they got a disability, so they can come to school, they just can't learn nothing. And so going on to college, where I actually entered college 2 years before the ADA, it was still that sense of having to fight. I was fortunate that my alma mater was accessible, which was light years ahead of its time in 87, 88, 89. But it still was a fact that out of all the schools that I could went to in Boston, I couldn't go to the schools in Boston because they were not accessible. And so now tied into that aha moment, it was after the ADA and marching in the Nickel conference where we went down to celebrate the seventh or the 8th year of the ADA, was one of those moments where it's like, damn, we still marching. We're still talking about our homes, not our nursing homes, our no homes, no nursing homes, nothing about us without us. We're still chanting that even though we now have legislation on the books that's supposed to be our version of civil rights. So those are the kind of memories that remind me that as much as we have the ADA, it still was not, it was great, it is great, but there are still things that need to be done. Where is the impact of the ADA and where is it not? The ADA is a significant piece of legislation, and it is a living, breathing document that has impacted my life in the positive in terms of, now I know that if I go to a hotel when I was traveling pre-COVID, that at least I can make the request to have an ADA accessible room, that I could expect in certain places to have accessible transportation, that I could expect these things. Much like, generations earlier when you were talking about, people of color or black folks in America, America expecting them to be treated as human, which is ironically the same thing the ADA's framework is supposed to be for. So those things being said, the shortcoming is not really a shortcoming other than the fact that people in America have been brainwashed into thinking disability is somehow bad or you're flawed, and that, it should be benevolent to have a door that opens or benevolent to have a menu in alternative format. those kind of things. I think that, in my experience, is where I think the ADA is not as strong as it could be in terms of where we should be with that law 30 years later. What would it be? What would be the one thing? The one thing, actually, to be candid, is for people to stop being stupid. And I say that with all seriousness. There is a level of, and I call it chosen stupidity, because at no point can you have a career in which you are an educator, a public official, uh, working in public service, public health, and still operate as if an individual with disabilities is not human, and still operate as if the law of the ADA is sort of some kind of benevolent handout for our community. That's like, oh, that's so nice. You want to do stuff like live and shop and be able to get around my store. Those kind of things. I think the one thing that would change everything is when we are now at this inflection point in time, where people are looking for leaders to actually do the job that they basically campaigned for. What is the point of campaigning? You're selling yourself as a job, that you can do the job. And for people with disabilities, what we need to look at as a community is, where is our political power? How do we consolidate that? How do we not just be a block for a particular party to lean on and then never deliver? So the one thing that I hope is that people learn for themselves. People become active, they get involved, they get engaged, and they understand that, democracy is not a passive activity. You have to be engaged, and regardless of whether or not you can get down the ramp or get into the booth, that there are ways, we are creative people on how to do that stuff. But the one thing that I would like to leave the community with, or leave anybody with, is that let's remember why the ADA had to happen. Let's remember why the ERA was attempted to happen. Let's remember why the Voting Rights Act had to happen. Let's remember why people are talking about immigration reform, why people are talking about civil rights, why people are talking about women's rights. Because fundamentally, people related to the last statement have chosen to be stupid and not governed from a place of policy, but from politics. And when you look at us as a community where we are 1 in 4, where we really are half of the country, if you include our mothers, our brothers, our sisters, our fathers, we are America. And for that to be cut off because a parent may or may not have a particular political ideology, ask yourself, is the person I'm supporting, for my child, the best thing? Like, yeah, down with taxes, yeah, save the environment, hug the tree, church and school, all of that. Those are hot button issues, but are they governing for your child and for your humanity? And so I would hope that when we celebrate the ADA, we celebrate its spirit of why it came about, which is to essence celebrate one's total humanity, regardless of the human condition. So the call to action is this: know the issues, know who you're dealing with. Understand that, much like I said before, the democracy is a participatory act, and that regardless of what your cognitive ability is, your physical, social, emotional, you have every right to be heard in this process. You have every right to go register and cast a vote. You have every right to, it doesn't matter. And if you are a parent of a child who is of age to vote, you should know that your child, if they do not vote, is going to be at the mercy of somebody who does not have their best interest at heart if they do not participate. So, whatever our political ideology is, at a certain point, we have to stop voting against our own interests. So the call to action is know the issues, know your rights, know how to vote. Secondly, get beyond basic disability partnerships. Back 20 years ago, we used to call it cross-cultural, cross-disability. Now just call it the community. Work across issues. We all have similar issues. There are some distinctions, but those are distinctions without a difference. If it really boils down to how do we live our life the most effective and independent way possible to bring us joy, let us all coalesce around what we need to do that and then move forward. That would be my call to action.